Good afternoon, everyone. Just leave it a moment we've got a lot of registrations today. We've had almost 800 people register for today's webinar, so we'll just leave it a moment to allow people to join. And thank you very much for those of you that have registered and are joining our suicide awareness webinar. Just give it a second. Whilst people are continuing to join, I'll just sort of start with a little bit of housekeeping. Also, just to introduce myself, my name's Nicola. I'm the Marketing Director here at Medigold Health, and I head up our webinar program. So we do run a lot of webinars throughout the year, so please just keep your eyes peeled for those. Yeah, and thank you for joining. I will also alert you, provide a trigger warning for today's webinar, because naturally the topic of suicide and self-harm is discussed throughout. And there will be, at the end, there's some signposting to some additional, external resources and professional resources should anyone need to access any of those post-webinar. As I say, we've had almost 800 people register today. So that's a fantastic figure. I think it's kind of demonstrates how important a topic this is. We are recording the webinar, and also you'll receive an email in the next day or so with a link to the recording, which feel free to share amongst your workplace or put on your intranet or whatever. We'll send you the link. And there is a Q&A function. Oh, sorry, yes, somebody's used it already. Hello, Charlotte. So yes, we will be sending a copy of the recording to refer back to. So there is a Q&A function. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type any questions that you have for our panelists throughout the webinar. We have got a Q&A section at the end of the webinar where we'll do our very best to answer as many of those as possible. As we have got such a big audience, if we can't get through all the questions, what we will do is collate all of those and produce an FAQ document, which we'll circulate as well, perhaps in the next week, I should imagine that will be. Just as a heads up as well about the questions, our panelists are all experts and they'll do their best to provide you with responses to the questions, but we won't be able to provide specific, where there's a very specific cases, we won't be able to kind of respond to those. Okay, I think we've kind of stalled a little bit on the people joining us, so I think it's probably time then to kick off. What I'll do is I will hand over now to our lovely panelists, starting with you, Nikki, if you'd just like to introduce yourself and then.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Nicole. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nikki Piper. I'm the Chief Nursing Officer here at Medigold Health. Been here for the past 4 years or so, and look forward to presenting my section today. Kath.
Hi, I'm Kath Wood, and I'm a disability training and consultancy specialist, and I lead on our products and consultancy, and I've been working in the field of disability, mental health and employment for over 15 years. Barrie?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barrie. I'm the suicide first aid instructor and mental health awareness coach here at Medigold Health. I've been working alongside Kath, not for as long as Kath has been with the business, but the last 8 years in the field of disability and suicide first aid. So I'll lead us on to our pathway for today's webinar. We'll be looking at statistics and dispelling some common myths around suicide. We'll also look at the history and the hidden toll of suicide itself, moving into signs and symptoms of someone who might be showing of having thoughts of suicide. I'm also going to provide you with a simple 3-step action plan that can move someone from a place of danger to a place of safety. And then we're going to talk through the role of occupational health and the strategic approach to mental health in the workplace. We'll also provide you with some useful resources and information covering services that are all on hand at the end of the webinar, and then we'll wrap up with looking at how to develop a mentally healthy culture, and then some time for questions and answers, as Nicole has already talked through. Through my own lived experience and through the work we do here at Medigold Health, our goal is to help build decisive and resilient communities of people inside and out of the workplace. I want to be part of a generation that raises groups of healthy, happy individuals. I also want to be part of a generation where psychological safety is just the norm in our workspaces, regardless of your field or regardless of any disability. I also want to be part of the generation that drastically reduces our national statistics for suicides, which is a sobering read, which we'll talk through. As Nicola's already indicated, we will be talking about suicide. I think it's personally important to talk and raise awareness about all topics of mental health, especially the socially and arguably upsetting topics such as suicide. By talking about it, it helps people to understand the topic more and ultimately becomes less of a taboo. But if you need to take 5 minutes during any part of the session, then please do. Let someone know you're okay and then take that time out. As we work through the webinar, you might come to a place where you start to wishing you would recognise the signs in someone else or wished you had done something before to help previously. This is completely natural. Okay, we all experience hindsight, and hindsight can be cruel. As much as I say there are almost always signs that someone is thinking about suicide, there may not always be opening to show them. Having come from a place of lived experience of suicide attempt myself, I can hand on heart say that people can wear the mask pretty well to hide how they're truly feeling. Before we delve into statistics though, Nick, I want to look at the word well-being, but more important, the word mental health. As you know, the webinar is called Everything Employers Need to Know to Protect the Wellbeing and Mental Health of Their People. So what does the term mental health actually mean? Society often follows the word mental health with a negative word, or the word that carries negative connotations. Mental health problems, mental health issues. But mental health is a state of well-being that enables us to cope with the stresses of life. It affects how we think, feel, act, behave, and helps us determine how we handle stress and how we relate to others in our lives. The fact is, everyone has mental health. Our overall health is made up of physical health and mental health. We have good days and bad days of both. Society conditions us to think that mental health is something to be scared of or something that carries that negative connotations. We're heavily influenced by media and peers that people living with a mental health condition are likely to be dangerous. Research shows that over a third of the public think that people with a mental health condition are likely to be violent, when in fact people who with a mental ill health are more dangerous to themselves than others, and 80 to 90% of people who die by suicide are experiencing some sort of mental distress. Next slide, please, Nick. Here we're going to look at some quite shocking and sobering statistics around suicide in particular. According to an NHS digital report, among the general population, 1 in 5 have had suicidal thoughts at some time. 1 in 14 have engaged in self-harm, and 1 in 15 have had a suicide attempt. In 2020, where the population was just over 67 million people, there were more than 17 people per day that died by suicide. However, these are just the reported suicides. A Mental Health Foundation reported that suicide is the leading cause of death in men under the age of 45. The suicide rate for men is around 3 times that for women, and males aged 45 to 49 continue to have the highest suicide rate, full stop. We're now going to move on to some common myths and misconceptions around suicide itself.
Yep. Okay, Barry, I'll talk to you about some common myths, and you can help to myth bust. So one of the common is people who talk about suicide aren't serious and won't actually do it.
So people who attempt or die by suicide have often told someone that they can't go on or life isn't worth living, and some have actually told someone that they actually want to die. So if we ignore these signs or not sure what to do, then we run the risk that that person might be serious and we could have helped them. What's the next one, Nicole?
People who say they're going to attempt suicide are just attention seeking. Yeah,
that's a common one that comes up. Anyone that says that they want to end their life should always be taken seriously. It may well be that they want our attention, not to show off, but to call out for help. For someone to talk about suicide, they must be really struggling to cope. And if we're able to help them get support, it could save their lives.
Okay. Do people who feel suicidal actually want to die?
Many people who feel suicidal don't actually want to die. they just want the pain to stop. And don't want to carry on living their life the way they are. They can't see another way out. This highlights how important a conversation about other options and support is so vital as well.
Okay, thanks, Barrie. Can talking or asking somebody about suicide actually make them want to do it?
So again, another misconception, suicide can be a taboo topic. It's difficult for us to talk about, and often the person doesn't want to burden anyone else with how they're feeling. If we ask someone directly about suicide, it gives them permission or an opportunity, if you like, to talk about it, and also how it tells us how serious the situation actually is for them. If we can get people talking, we can help guide them to the support and then help them see another way out of how they're feeling. If we don't talk or ask about suicide, we may miss the opportunity to intervene and support.
Thanks, Barrie. And if somebody's serious about suicide, then surely there's nothing we can actually do?
Feeling actively suicidal can be temporary. Even if someone has been feeling low, anxious, or struggling to cope for a long period of time, a simple conversation showing that someone cares and being able to guide them and support them through can make a huge difference. But it's important to note that some people will go on to attempt or die by suicide, whatever we do. We can only try our best to help. What this does tell us, though, is that every single one of us can have an impact on preventing suicide. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the suicide first aid instructor for Medigold. And one question I get asked on the course that I deliver is suicide legal or illegal? So out of the 441 attendees, just take a couple of seconds to have a think for yourself. Is suicide legal or illegal in the UK? Next slide, please, Nicola. Some people say, surely you can be arrested for attempting to take your own life. Surely you can be arrested for attempting or putting others' lives in danger. Or I know a situation where police were involved and they did take the person away. The answer is no. You cannot be arrested for attempting to take your own life. You can be detained for your own safety into a place of safety, but you cannot be arrested. As you can see on the slide there, suicide hasn't been a criminal offence in the UK since the 3rd of August 1961. Up until then, it used to be called self-murder, which was a crime under common law in England in the mid-13th century, but long before that, it was condemned as a mortal sin in the eyes of the church. To put things into perspective of how far we've come along, 1956, I think it was, there were 5,387 suicide attempts known to the police. Of those, 613 were prosecuted. Most were discharged, fined, or put on probation. 33 of them were actually sent to prison. So the 3rd of August 1961, a petition was submitted to government to decriminalise the act of self-murder, but in turn create a new offence, which was aiding, abetting, and instigating the suicide of another, which, as we now know, is assisted suicide. So when we talk about suicide, the language which we use matters. So we'll talk about language and stigma, because words do matter. Suicide behaviour and suicide itself is highly stigmatised. We're all on the course here, all on the call today, to help destigmatise suicide, and that's our responsibility. And the language which we choose to use can increase or reduce stigma. The phrase committed suicide or commit suicide carries that negative connotations as it originates from the historical treatment of suicide as a criminal offence or criminal act, as I just mentioned. Using mental health language sensitively at all times shows baseline respect. Certain language sensationalizes mental illnesses and reinforces that stigma, and the terminology we use can suggest a lack of quality of life for people with mental illnesses, and labeling a person by their mental illnesses reduces their identity to that illness themselves. First-person language shows respect for the individual and reinforces the fact that their condition does not define them. How you speak about mental health might also influence the way your friends, your colleagues, your family will think and also speak about the subject. Let's have a look at the impact and the hidden toll of suicide itself. As said, in 2020, there were 6,221 reported suicides in the UK, just over 17 people per day. But what is a reported suicide? Well, A reported suicide is where there's been a sudden death. The police, the coroner have investigated it, and there was sufficient supporting information to establish, through the balance of probabilities, that the person who did the suicide behaviour died with the intention of taking their own life. We talk about reported suicides, so what about the unreported suicides? A lot of suicides go unreported. Maybe there was a lack of information, and thus they're reported as death by misadventure or accidental deaths. 5 to 25% more suicides occur each year that are not even reported as suicides. The positive news is that most people who do suicide behaviour, that is, behave in a way that might result in their death, will live. And this is something that we need to hold on to. It's estimated that 40 to 100 times the number of people who die by suicide will make a suicide attempt and survive. So by comparison to the number of people practicing suicide behaviour, the actual conclusion of death by suicide is a relatively comparatively rare event. So what about the people thinking about suicide? The Samaritans and the Office for National Statistics estimates 5% of us thinking about suicide at any given time. So that's 1 in 20 of us right now could be thinking about suicide. Thinking about the workplaces, community groups, faith groups, 1 in 20 of us could be thinking about suicide. It's fair to say suicide could affect us all. I'm going to move on to some suicide warning signs. So when someone is thinking about suicide, their words and actions can give you clues that they're at risk of hurting themselves. I want to introduce the idea of spotting these signs and symptoms in relation to our senses. So the things we sense from others, the things we hear people say, the actions we see people do, and things we may learn that has happened or are happening or going to happen in someone's life. So the bottom right, the feelings. We might be able to sense that someone is thinking about suicide. That is that unsettled feeling, that gut feeling that someone's not quite right with that person. We might sense that they're feeling worthless or hopeless. But other changes in emotions such as anger, sadness, anxiety can give us clues as well. People thinking of suicide could be feeling a whole manner of emotions. They could be devoid of feeling, any feeling. Think about anything that could be just out of character for that person. Moving up, still using our senses, we move from our feelings to our ears. We sometimes express our thoughts consciously and sometimes unconsciously, without even know why we're saying it. So let's move our senses from our feelings to sounds, to things you may hear. We might pick up and hear phrases like, no one is going to miss me when I'm gone. I don't want to be here anymore. I've had enough. I can't take it any longer. I'm sorry. I won't be a burden for much longer. Moving our senses from our ears to our eyes. People sometimes do things you can see. Maybe people putting their affairs in order, making amends for past wrongdoings. Withdrawing, isolating themselves further, writing a suicide note, self-harming behaviours. Certain life events and circumstances can put people under additional pressure and reduce their ability to cope. So life events do affect us all differently, such as loss, events associated with loss, redundancy, divorce, bereavement, bankruptcy, bullying or any sort of abuse, a health deterioration. You might not be able to spot these signs and these emotions straight away, but they all show up differently in everyone. If you recognise, feel, sense or see something that just gives us a gut feeling that something isn't quite right, then we need to have a conversation with that person. Whether you refer to them as challenging conversations, difficult conversations, courageous conversations, they're not easy. So I want to provide you all with a basic action plan that can form the foundations of any situation that you might find yourself in. So the action plan starts with step number 1, which is check for signs and ask. So being aware of the above signs and symptoms and also trusting your gut is the first part of the journey. Regardless of what the situation is, there will always almost be signs, either consciously or unconsciously. And that's something that shows that person isn't in a good place. If there are signs that emerge that the person may be having thoughts of suicide, then we need to ask about that. Don't get drawn into false questions like, have you thought about doing something silly, or have you thought about harming yourself? After you've opened the conversation, ask clearly and openly about suicide. Have you got thoughts of suicide? If it makes things easier, put that question into context. By asking the question clearly and directly, you're giving that person permission to talk about how they're feeling. You're giving them permission to share the biggest secret that they've probably ever had to share. Remember, though, thoughts do not mean actions. Step number 2 is listening. If you know someone who is struggling, I think the most valuable thing is to let that person know that you care. This isn't the time to come up with advice, because advice is subjective based on your own values and beliefs. But it's a time to come up with some questions, like, try and tell me why. What are the options? Have you spoken to someone else about this? How are you feeling? When they start talking, actively listen to them, thinking about your body language, posture, appropriate levels of eye contact. And bear in mind, your relationship with this person is more likely growing minute by minute because you are taking the time to listen and explore what their current situation means for them. And the final step is step number 3, which is help or signposting. You shouldn't be the only supporter, helper, steerer in that person's life. You might be a support, but you shouldn't be the only support for that person. Signposting to other fantastic services out there is what this step is all about. And we'll look at signposting later on in the webinar. I'm now going to hand over to Nikki, who will talk us through the role of occupational health.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Nicole. So I'm going to kind of focus more around what happens in the workplace, because often that's where someone may well kind of open up, or you may pick up the signs and use those skills that Barry's just covered. So I think the important thing from my perspective is if someone has opened up, that you're receptive and able to kind of listen to them and then look at what needs to go from there onwards. So it's about looking at the level of risk, and by doing a dynamic risk assessment, if you like, but without all the paperwork that often we associate risk assessment with, it's around having that open conversation with the person, you know, reassurance for them that, you know, they've spoke openly and you're here to listen and offer some guidance. The important thing to drill down into is to look at how high level risk that person is at that given time. So by being able to kind of ask some questions around what their thoughts are, if they've got a plan for their action of suicide, and what that plan involves, how far they've gone down that plan. So by gently easing and questioning the individual to understand where their thought processes are, it will then help you decide what your action as a manager, as a HR personnel, or as a friend or colleague can actually do and action at that time. So if they've got a really clear plan, they've got all the means in which they can follow through that plan, then they're in a very high risk category. And it's really important to have that kind of supportive conversation and look at signposting or taking them physically to see a doctor, be it to the hospital if the risk is great and it's just you and them and the workplace. Get them to that place of safety where an assessment can be made for them. If it's a matter of speaking to their GP, which you can pick up the phone and book them a GP appointment, explain the level of risk and concern you have, and get them to the GP where, again, a proper full assessment can be made for them. That's kind of really key if they've got a really clear plan. If you're uncertain, always go to the high level risk and it can be worked back from there. If they've got the idea that they want to take their own life, but they haven't really kind of decided how, when, where, what, then obviously the risk is slightly less, but not to be ignored equally, at which point in both levels you could involve family if they have immediate support, because that's a really good way of opening this conversation. Sometimes families are completely unaware that this is how an individual's feeling. So by gaining their confidence, their reassurance, and starting to open up that support system for them, it starts to help them kind of come to terms that someone cares about them. They're recognizing that they need some help and support. Thanks, Nicole. And I think it's really important to do that activity before you even consider a referral into the occupational health remit. This is kind of the immediate first aid If someone comes to you and they're asking for that level of help and support, then deal with that element first. As a provider, we do offer a duty management service to people to give them that confidence to have that conversation and get that person to a place of safety. But if you don't have that, hopefully today's session will help you make those decisions and carry out that dynamic risk assessment to get them to that place of safety. So before referring to them to occupational health, as I say, do that immediate risk assessment and ensure that they've got the support that they need in the here and now to help them through that kind of crisis moment. Thereafter, really good to get them into the occupational health environment. So once they're kind of through that crisis or being supported with that crisis, look at referring them into us for that either return to work process or the support whilst they're off work unwell. So work with them on the referral, because that helps them see that you as a employer are really keen to do all the right things to get them through this crisis time in their life. And pop in that referral form, all the things that you've done to support that individual or the action plans you're aware of to make sure you've got a good firm structure of support. As I say, include them in that referral process, because it's then about what we can do thereafter, and make sure that they're engaged in the whole process. It's really important to do this at the right time and not kind of to rush things through. And there are a few key questions that I've just flagged up on screen here, which you might want to incorporate into that referral. Are they currently fit to be at work? I know that's a commonly asked question, but it may well be if the crisis situation is very high, they're probably not fit to be at work at that time. But as we know, work is really good for us, and it's really good from a mental health perspective, as long as the work environment is supportive and right for them, which we can talk a little bit more about in Kath's section shortly. What support can you put in place for them? There's often quite a bit of support, and I'm going to go on to adjustment shortly, but it's about kind of just understanding what they feel they might need without then the professional input from ourselves. Do you need to consider a reduction in workload? Is the employee got the right support? So you can ask all of those direct questions as part of your occupational health referral. I think one of the key questions for me, and often is impacting, is not necessarily what medication are they taking, which is commonly asked, but really the impact on that medication on their ability to carry out their role. Because often heavy duty medication, which is often required in the early stages of someone with a mental health crisis, can have some quite dramatic side effects. So it's those kind of side effects that's important to understand what impact that might have on their ability to do the role they have. Thanks, Nicole. So there are a few recommendations, and these are not exhaustive. I've just kind of looked at some of the key things that are likely to help and support that individual. So looking at the workload when they're at the point of being able to return to work. As I say, in a mental health crisis, it's really difficult to maintain focus, remember things. They're classic signs that someone's struggling. So by reducing workload to single tasks and letting them complete that single task before then giving another task, certainly helps them focus on the job in hand, but also will allow them to kind of continue to contribute and be a part of the work environment and society in some respects too. Reduced working hours is also a really useful adjustment to put in place. Often sleep patterns become very erratic during a mental health crisis, and so they kind of wake up in the middle of the night and fall deep asleep in the morning. So it's about giving them some flexibility about start finish times without completely taking out routine, because routine is also a really positive behavior to have whilst you're working through that crisis. Good to allocate a mentor or a buddy or any kind of co-worker support system that you might have. Sometimes the manager's a good person. Sometimes they're closer to somebody else in the workplace. So allocating someone that they feel comfortable with, who they can feel they can trust and be open to. Everyone in the office isn't necessarily needing to be involved, but as long as there's some key people that the individual feels they can go to, where they feel they need to get out of the room or do something, a bit like we said earlier, let people know you're safe, but actually just need to take a moment out, then that's a really useful support structure to put in place. Provision of a quiet place or a breakout space or a safe space, whatever you want to call that, again, is a good tool for some quiet time to just take yourself out, give yourself that moment to regroup, refashion, and then come back into the workplace feeling you've given yourself that breakout. A stress risk assessment, again, is a really good tool to use. It's both for the individual and for you as a manager or friend or whoever you might be in the support process. And it helps work through and look at some key trigger factors that may have an issue for that individual and help you kind of iron those out and move them along to a later date to deal with. It's about just very small little steps to support. And, you know, as I said, sleep is an issue. And it's about just understanding that and being supportive, giving people the opportunity to talk if they need to talk, but also a protective, safe space within the work environment. Thanks, Nicole. Over to Kath.
Thank you. And I guess what Nicola, Nikki particularly has been talking about is the reactive approach to when somebody is in crisis or distress. Where I'm going to take this next section is to look at some of the preventative measures or the proactive strategies that you can implement as a business to try and reduce that impact of work on mental health and really educate and raise awareness across the business so that we can try and intervene more quickly and earlier when somebody is struggling, so we don't get to that distress and crisis situation. So I'm going to start with looking at how you kind of gather data and information in your business and what you know already about how common poor mental health or mental ill health is in your business. What impact and cost is it having on your business? So let's think about disclosure. So do you know how many people in your business have a mental health condition? You could collect that data during recruitment. It could come up through sickness absence reporting. You know, does your HR system even allow you to collect that kind of information? You know, and really reflect on how accurate you think that is, because even though we are working towards reducing stigma, people still don't always tell you when an absence is related to mental ill health. What opportunities do we give people to update information? You know, does it come up in annual reviews? And really, how do we encourage and share people to share that information with us? Ultimately, sometimes you have to show that you are a more supportive business before people feel comfortable to open up and disclose. Other data you might have a look at is uptake of any resources or services that you offer. So number of clicks on an intranet page, or it might be number of referrals of any services that you implement. And I'll talk a little bit more about services shortly. Let's have a look at your absence figures. So what does your absence reporting say? Do you feel that you've got accurate reporting of how many days are lost due to mental ill health? And do you know how much that costs you? For example, how much overtime or agency workers or temporary workers do you have to pay to cover that absence? And do you have any way of measuring what that absence costs on productivity? But obviously, it's not just those people who are absent. Mental ill health can cause people to struggle to perform to their full capacity. That's what we call presenteeism. So again, it's difficult to measure, but do you have any way of looking at that in your business? And finally, let's look at leavism. So how many people leave your business due to mental ill health? How many people leave while they're off sick with mental health problems? And what does your exit interviews say about somebody's mental health? Are there any patterns? Are there any useful information that you could pick up on your leaving data? As I said, we need to mention services and resources. And one of the key things to putting things into place as a business is to have a foundation of the right services, tools and resources available. Do you have an employee assistance programme? If so, this could be really, really helpful, as it provides employees with access to a full range of experts, mental health professionals, but also to help with some of the causes of mental ill health, with dealing with legal matters, childcare, and other factors that are influencing somebody's stress levels. Most EAPs also provide direct access to mental health support and allow employees to get some counselling, and that can obviously help speed up the process, that people can access that therapy much quicker than they might be able to do through the NHS. It's important that we let employees know about these kind of services and exactly what it provides. In most businesses, it's well underutilised. Sometimes employees can be reluctant to use it because it's provided by their employer. They don't believe the information is going to be independent and confidential, and they believe it will be reported back to their manager. So we need to reassure them that this service is independent and confidential. We've already heard about the input of occupational health that Nikki has been talking about. So it's important that you understand what support your occupational health service can provide around mental health. Sometimes people assume that it deals mainly with physical health, but occupational health can have a really good input on providing that expertise and looking at how the workplace could be affecting somebody's health and how health is affecting the workplace. And that's a really important independent expert view that you could seek. You should also have a think about the health and wellbeing initiatives that you generally have available in the business, what information you have on your intranet. And even if you don't have the resource to create your own intranet pages, you can provide links to other organisations, some of which I'll talk about later in signposting. You may also provide some wellbeing related employee benefits, or have a health and wellbeing platform, and anything that's also aimed at physical health can have benefits for somebody's mental wellbeing too. So again, it's important that people know where that information is and that it's mentioned regularly through team meetings and discussions, so that people really understand where that support is in place, particularly as they can access a lot of this support without ever having talked to somebody. So if the stigma is still preventing somebody from talking about their mental health at work, at least we know that they have the opportunity to access that support before they talk to anybody. We've already heard mention of a stress risk assessment, really highly recommended for a situation where somebody is experiencing stress or work may be contributing to their mental ill health. It's also quite a useful proactive tool to look at preventative measures to prevent people feeling overwhelmed by their work. So it can be used as a proactive tool as well as a reactive tool. Another option might be a wellness recovery action plan. So this may be something that an individual who's being supported by a mental health support service may already have in place, that they've completed with the support of that service. But some businesses choose to have their own version and may just call it a wellness action plan. And this is really about helping people to explain and articulate their mental health. It helps them to collate all of that in one place. So it really helps people to understand what good mental health looks like for them. What are the early signs and symptoms that we should look out for? What are the signs and symptoms of a crisis or distressing period? Are there any particular triggers and how those can be avoided or managed? And what should somebody do if they're going to support that person in crisis? And it's really important that this is completed by the individual about their own mental health, with support of others if they wish. But the most important principle is that they own it, it's their information, and it really helps to guide those of us who are supporting them. And it provides that informed consent for us to act in their best interests if they are in a period of crisis, which often gives us a lot of comfort that we are doing the right thing that that person wants us to do, even if they're not in a place to be able to do that for themselves. Lastly, there is a disability and health passport. This could be a really useful document to go with the person as they move around the business. So it can be detailing any information about their health condition or disability, how it affects their work, and what support and adjustments they might need to be able to complete their work effectively. Again, the individual completes it themselves, and it's then used in a discussion with their line manager to make those agreements. And those agreements follow with them if they change teams, if the manager changes. So that's a really reassuring, consistent approach to the support of that person, so people don't feel like they have to explain themselves over and over again, or that their workplace adjustments become at risk if there's any change in their team or their manager. So it's really important that you think about these kind of tools that can guide and advise and actually give that person ownership of how they manage their own mental health at work. So all of these services and resources, if they're in place, they need to be well publicised and talked about. And we'll talk a little bit more around culture and kind of awareness raising, because they do all link together. You can have the best services in the world, but if they're not publicised, they're not going to have the benefit that you want. So next, we should think about policies and processes. And there's lots of different ways that your policies and processes can support those experiencing mental ill health. Through the recruitment process, this is about how you open up opportunities for people to apply, even though they're experiencing symptoms. So does your processes, are they easy to follow? Can they be adjusted if needed? And do those involved in hiring and recruiting have enough mental health training to be aware of how to make adjustments, so that we're not excluding anybody from joining the business if they have mental ill health? During onboarding, do you use a health questionnaire? And most importantly, where does this information go? It may go to occupational health for an assessment. It may go to the line manager to ensure that adjustments are put into place. But most importantly, any information that's shared at this point has to have that benefit for that person in work. So it needs to go to the key people involved in implementing that support for somebody. One of the most important policies to look at is sickness absence or absence management. Is it supportive to those who are experiencing poor mental health? Do you encourage keeping in touch during absences? Do you give really key information about support services to that person when they're absent so that they can access that support? Do you talk about phased returns or workplace adjustments in any guidance that a manager has? Is that included in the return to work process? And does that process continue? Do people have additional regular reviews afterwards to make sure that the support and the adjustments that were needed as a transition back to work are still being helpful? Do you have in your policies an ability to exclude disability-related absence in your absence management triggers? And do you make sure that return to work process actually supports that transition effectively and considers mental health as along with physical health? There are a few other policies which have an influence over our culture and how supported people feel. So things that are around ED&I, dignity at work, or bullying and harassment are really important for a mentally healthy workplace, because that actually ensures that the business provides equal opportunities to people and prevents bullying, harassment and victimisation, all of which can have an influence over somebody's mental health. So are these policies in place? Do they reference health, disability and mental health? And is there a commitment within that to positive mental health and supporting mental ill health? So that would be a really useful thing to reassure people who may be going through difficult times at work. And finally, there could be a need for a safeguarding policy. Some organisations will have that regarding customers and members of the public, but actually you could also need to put something in place for the safeguarding of colleagues. So is there ability for somebody to raise an alert if they have a concern about somebody's health and well-being? You know, it may be that the person doesn't come to somebody to talk about contemplating suicide, but somebody may have a suspicion that people are in that difficult place, and maybe they need a reporting route and to know what their options are when they do come across those kinds of conversations. Other policies which can support good mental health at work include flexible working and hybrid working, family-friendly policies such as special leave, maternity, paternity and adoption leave, and a menopause policy. All of these factors can have a positive benefit on how supported people feel at work. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by some of this information, don't worry, as our team of consultants can support with much of this work. And we also can offer some mental health training to key people in the business, which is also a really important part of any strategy. So firstly, around training and knowledge and confidence, line managers are key to this. Are they equipped to support employees? They can have a really positive influence on the mental health employees, and they are the front end of implementing your policies and processes. They're also best placed to offer support and signpost colleagues to the right services. So it's really important that line managers are engaged in the topic of mental health, and given that knowledge and confidence, they are the front end of how a business directly supports its employees. HR colleagues are really important because that in-depth knowledge that they can hold on these topics can really guide and support and advise managers. So really key that HR have that expertise within the department. Do you need to think about alternative routes for people to seek support? Not everybody wants to talk to their line manager about their concerns and difficulties around mental health. You know, they may worry about what's going to happen to their job. They may worry, they may not have the right relationship with their line manager to talk that through. So things like mental health first aiders, suicide first aiders, and mental health champions, ordinary colleagues spread throughout the business, can be a really useful route for people to seek support outside of their line management channels. And do you offer that mental health training or mental health awareness to all employees? It's particularly important at the start of employment that they understand the support services are available and how to look after their own mental health. They also to consider what support and training you might offer if they are undergoing periods of stress or their role puts them at risk of stress. You may need to think about certain groups of people within your business might benefit from that additional awareness or training around mental health. So now let's look a little bit around culture change and communication and raising awareness. So actually, all of this good work that you're putting in behind the scenes doesn't have the true effect that you want it to have unless it's embedded and individuals in the business feel supported and feel comfortable to open up and have a discussion. So for general awareness raising, you can really just use key awareness days and weeks that already exist in the calendar. You can see a few on the list there. There's one nearly every month of the year. So you can pick and choose the events and look at where you can fit those into your wellbeing calendars, for example. The advantage of using some of these existing months and awareness days is that most of the organisations linked to these events provide free resources anyway. So you don't need to create new resources from scratch. You don't need to have a huge marketing campaign created for you. All of that is usually held within those charities or those organisations linked to those awareness days. So once you've decided on which event you wanted to use, pick maybe 2 or 3 during the year to kind of really raise awareness. There's different ways that you can utilise those resources to have impact in your business. Here's just a few of them. But what I would suggest is don't reinvent the wheel. Use your existing communication channels. Know what you understand about the audience. So how do they normally access information, and use those to the most effect. And you'll be able to pick and choose different options to suit different parts of your business, for example. So emails to all colleagues or messages through Teams can be really helpful to reach everybody, as long as they access the intranet and that information. You can share links or videos, blogs or vlogs, or post articles from other organisations on your intranet. So audio visual options are usually pretty good for reaching those people who don't read a lot of articles. So thinking about your videos or your vlogs. Posters and displays can be really good, whether you have notice boards, or I really like the back of the toilet door poster because it does really attract people's attention. Sometimes you might want to associate a day with a fundraising campaign, a cake sale, a dress down day. You might want to create something that managers can use in team meetings or put on team meeting agendas. And you could invite guest speakers in or have an event that you're going to invite people to attend. As I said, you don't need to create all of your own mental health content. There are lots of different specialist organisations that have information you can use. And here on the slide, you can see a few specialist organisations that we're just going to highlight. And they can provide different types of support. So you can see we've got charities and organisations such as Mind, Calm and Rethink. There are lots of other charities as well that have a good range of information. There are organisations that provide helplines, 24-hour crisis helpline from Samaritans. The Shout is a text support line, and then Sane has an evening helpline, and also Calm has a chat as well. And then you've got different apps that you could recommend to people for maintaining good mental health and wellbeing. Thrive, Headspace and Insight Timer are just a couple or 3 to have a think about. And online resources such as Every Mind Matters from the NHS and the Hub of Hope can be really, really helpful. The Hub of Hope is the database of local support services, so people can search by their own postcode to find what's available in their own areas, which is really useful if you have a wide-reaching national organisation. And that's a whistle-stop tour through the kind of strategy approach to improving the mental health of your workforce and hopefully preventing people from getting to the crisis. Now back to Nikki, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Kath and Barrie and Nikki. so insightful, and we've had lots and lots of questions. I will just stop sharing my screen as well. So yeah, we've had a lot of questions, so we've got 10 minutes. I'll try and get through as many as we can, but if not, as I said at the start, what we'll do is we'll collate the questions and answers and send it out as an FAQ document as well, so you'll have that sort of resource within the workplace. There's quite a few. I think this was kind of off the back of your discussion, Nikki, and quite a few people have asked about what happens if people don't want to go to the hospital, don't want to go to their GP. What would you recommend when you're talking to them and trying to persuade them to do that if they're classed as a high risk or an amber?
Sure. I think Barrie can probably add to this too from the mental health first aid side of things. Usually, once you've had that kind of confidence building conversation with them, you've reassured them, you've explored what they'd like to do, because it's not something that you want to ignore, and they've clearly brought it to your attention. So it's about kind of engaging with that side of it and saying, look, you've talked to me around this. This is how I feel these are some options we've got. What feels more comfortable for you? And kind of doing that gentle persuasion, bursting any concerns that they're going to be, arrested or taken away or anything like that, to kind of build that confidence. And it's about going and talking to someone who's a professional in that area of the field and having that conversation and giving them the confidence to feel that they can do that. So you can't frog march them. That's really not going to work. But it's about engaging, building trust, and kind of giving them the opportunity to explore what would help them at this time, because they've brought it to you for a reason. I don't know if you want to add anything on there, Barrie.
Yeah, so I fully agree, Nikki. Obviously, there's a couple of things you can do. I would try to empower that person to seek out resources. As Kath mentioned, there's tons of resources out there. One that I've particularly used before with colleagues and friends is the Hub of Hope. Yes, it's got the details of national organisations like the NHS and Mind, but very much so it's got the smaller organisations which are often born out of personal lived experience as well, which is probably more appropriate and probably more approachable for a lot of people. Not to mention probably quicker to get seen support, because obviously the larger support organisations are inundated. There's nothing stopping individuals ringing 101 and asking for a welfare check. You can call the police and ask for a welfare check or safe and well check. But failing that, obviously, if someone is in immediate, I've seen a message come up. If someone is in immediate danger, 999. Full stop.
Yeah.
Keep yourself safe. Talk to that person whilst keeping yourself safe, and 999. Bottom line.
Okay. Thank you both. And I think that's covered some of the questions as well, that where you said there, Barrie, about calling 101, because quite a few people have asked as well what to do about staff that are working from home, so that some of this is obviously kind of relating to in person, but working from home. And I don't know if you want to add to that.
I just think it's important to note that is the last resort, because it takes up resources of the police and the ambulance service. So you should be trying every avenue to contact them directly. You should be their next of kin, and then but only if you cannot contact them and you have a real reason to suspect that they are at risk of harming themselves, should you call that 101. But it is there to make sure that they are safe and well if needed.
But if we're on top of that, I fully agree with everything. But I think if we are driving a culture shift to make it known that it is okay not to be okay, and the culture shift that we can talk about things and talk about how we're feeling despite of who you are and what you are, then those other longer term, further down the line issues will start to become diluted, because they won't become an issue if people are open up and talking, regardless.
Thank you. Quite a lot of people have asked, what's the difference between a mental health first aider and a suicide first aider? Barrie?
Yeah, so I have put a couple of messages back. So the mental health first aid course is mental health first aid adult course is a 2-day course which we deliver on behalf of Mental Health First Aid England. There is a Mental Health First Aid Scotland and Wales. It is a all-rounded package to support, identify and upskill people around the most common mental health concerns. There is a touch on session 3 of day 1. There is a touch on suicide, whereas the suicide first aid course has 2 versions. You've got a light, which is a 3-hour course, or you've got a full day course, which heavily goes into the focus part of the action plan, signs and symptoms, and just focuses on more so on suicide first aid. So mental health first aiders do touch on it, whereas the suicide first aiders are not say the experts, but a lot more attuned to the topic of suicide.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you, Barrie. Is it recommended that an OH referral is always made as part of managing either long-term absence due to someone recently experiencing suicidal thoughts, or when managing their return to work following this experience? Perhaps one for you, Nikki. So should a referral always form part of that process?
I think it's a good idea to start reasonably early in the plan. I think you need to certainly get the crisis moment over first and make sure that the appropriate immediate support's in place for them. And I think part of that return, or thinking of a return to work, or planning a return to work, or ongoing support while they're off work, that's where the OH support and the guidance will come in most useful for the individual. So it may well be a bit of a, should I do it now? Shall I hang on a little bit? I think once the immediacy of the crisis is managed, then getting that guidance and support from your occupational health provision is a really useful tool to help guide your managers through that next stage of the keeping in touch, of the, looking at the kind of wellbeing plans or stress risk assessment plans, whatever support systems are required. They will come as part of the recommendations to help build that confidence to that day for that return to work, and then the adjustments to be put in place once they come back into the workplace.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Nikki.
The short answer, yes.
Yes. Thank you. No, that's good. Perhaps one for you, Kath, I think, in terms of the training. So somebody's saying, Helen Pierce, thank you, Helen, experiencing concerns from colleagues who are facing discussions of suicide and mental health from customers, either over the telephone or in person. Should appreciate any advice on how we can best support our colleagues to deal with this too. And I guess that comes down to back to what you were saying about training, Kath.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the examples we didn't give in there was that we've specifically been asked to create a course for customer facing staff to be able to deal with behaviours. So not just people becoming vulnerable, but also people becoming challenging due to the symptoms they're experiencing. So we've put together a programme specifically for customer facing staff, and that's delivered to anybody who works with customers, telephone, online support, or face to face. So it can be adapted, because it is important that you still are able to serve your customers well and provide the service, even though people are experiencing symptoms, but also understanding how to resolve some of the challenges that come up because of the behaviour people are presenting. So I do think it's worth looking at how you invest in training for those people who are, and there's certain teams within certain organisations that have that happen more often. So things like maybe housing associations dealing with homelessness, or people dealing with debt management, may come across those sets of symptoms and those circumstances more frequently. So it might be worth targeting that at certain teams within your business.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We have got a question here. Stress risk assessment. Would this be done by EAP or an independent consultant or a psychologist if high stress is flagged in employees? How can that be conveyed to employers due to confidentiality?
So a stress. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Nikki.
Sorry. So a stress risk assessment really is something that the employer carries out with the employee and identifies some of the triggering factors within the workplace that are causing that stress, and then looks at what opportunities within the workplace they can manage those trigger factors of stress for that individual. So that may well be something as simple as looking at the workload, looking at the distribution of the workload for a given period of time, or it could be, maybe splitting the job in some way and changing that process until they build the strength back up to be able to cope with what is their workload at that given time. So there wouldn't be a huge point in it being someone external, because the manager or the equivalent manager or someone that they trust within the workplace, along with that individual, are usually the people that can identify some of the factors that have contributed to where they've got to, or that are irritating where they are at present. So, you know, it's best done as an internal process to be able to then look at what opportunities there are to resolve those triggering factors.
Really good structure. It's really good structure for a conversation, particularly if you're not sure what's causing your work-related stress or not sure how to phrase it in a conversation. It can be quite a good tool to open up the conversation between you and your line manager.
Thank you. We have come to 1 o'clock. Just think we could probably squeeze this last one in. How can we support men going through mental health issues, especially when there are over 3,000 male suicides per year in the UK? I'll hand that over to you, Barrie, and then we will close the webinar, but there will be an FAQ document.
Well, why was that, Nikki? No, I'm joking. So men and mental health, obviously we collectively, everyone's responsibility is to reduce that toxic masculinity. I would stereotypically fall into that bracket. A, being male, B, 30.5 years in the military, only child as well. I was told by my dad, come on boys, don't cry. So I fall into that stereotypical view of men not being able to talk, because feeling like they shouldn't be able to talk. But if we make it known, as I said earlier on, if we make it known that it is okay not to be okay, and we can talk regardless of who you are, we should be able to have those conversations with people. And I think personally it's more of a generational thing. I think today's generation, youngsters are more open to talk about things regardless of who they are. But as long as we can continue to drive that toxic masculinity and reduce that, I think that's the way forward.
So I've just got one quick thing to add. If you've got anybody in your organisation who feels comfortable telling their own personal story, particularly if they're a prominent male in the business, that's really useful. But there are hundreds of different male celebrities out there who've talked about their poor mental health. We've got our own ambassador, haven't we, within Medigold, who's done some talks as well. So for me, it's about reaching out and using some examples of people who are the most male stereotypical testosterone-driven person. You know, people like the sports people who are traditionally thought to be that typical testosterone-driven male, actually talking about their mental health can be a really good conversation starter.
I agree, Kath. When I talk about my own personal experience, often that hits home often more so than the actual context on the slide can notice itself.
Okay, thank you. Thanks ever so much, panelists. Thank you ever so much to our audience for tuning in and all your questions. As I say, there will be a link to the recording shared either today or tomorrow, and some further details around the stats and that in there, but also over the next week we will collate and respond to the questions and send out an FAQ document as well. So feel free to share these far and wide within your organisation. We have Suicide Prevention Day next week, so you've got some content that you please feel free to share within your organisations to get the awareness out there. So thanks ever so much, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.